It was ugly, underpowered, and its pilots could barely move inside the cockpit. But the Henschel HS129, the Panzerquacker, the battle duck, might be the most important ground attack aircraft ever built. Because without it, we never get the A-10 Warthog. Now, those duck nicknames have been floating around in your comments for months, and not once did we use them in the original video. 5 of you did, though, so consider this me catching up. And while we're on the subject of things you spotted before I did, a good number of you made a very specific claim that this cramped, unreliable, chronically broken German ground attacker is the direct conceptual ancestor of America's most iconic close air support aircraft. You drew the line from the HS129 to the A-10 Warthog. One of you even supplied the detail about a certain pilot's memoir that ties the whole thing together. So today we're going to take your thesis, treat it as a hypothesis, and run it against the evidence, properly, with real specifications, real names, and real honesty about where it holds up and where it gets thin. Because if this connection is real, it deserves better than bar trivia. And if it isn't, you deserve to know that too. Let's start with the aircraft itself, not what happened to it on the battlefields of the Eastern Front, because frankly nobody in the comments cared about the battle chronology we spent all that time on last time, and fair enough. What matters here is what the HS129 was designed to be, and why the specific engineering choices made at the Henschel Works between 1937 and 1939 would echo decades later in an aircraft built on the other side of the world. The HS129 was born from a 1937 Luftwaffe specification that asked for something the Luftwaffe had never truly possessed. A purpose-built, heavily armoured ground attack aircraft designed from the first pencil stroke to survive fire from below while killing tanks. Twin engines using non-priority power plants, the Luftwaffe's best engines were reserved for fighters and bombers. Substantial armour, heavy forward-firing armament, and a cockpit positioned close to the nose so the pilot could actually see what he was shooting at. Henschel's chief designer, Friedrich Nikolaus, took that brief and produced a machine where every single decision served one god: survivability over the battlefield at the expense of almost everything else. At the expense of everything else. Remember that phrase. His prototype, the HS129V1, flew for the first time around 26 May 1939. And what followed was a long, painful education in the difference between a sound concept and a functional aeroplane. The original engines were a disaster. The V1 flew on 2 Argus AS410 inverted V engines, producing a meagre 465 horsepower each. They'd been chosen precisely because they were non-priority, satisfying the specification but leaving the airframe pathetically short of thrust. Pilots reported the aircraft was sluggish, unresponsive, and genuinely dangerous in any maneuver beyond the gentlest of turns. The solution came not from German engineering, but from conquest. After the fall of France, stocks of captured Gnome-Rhone 14M 14-cylinder radial engines became available as war booty. Each could produce about 700 horsepower, a real improvement, and this swap gave rise to the definitive HS129B series. But even with the French engines, this thing remained stubbornly underpowered. Empty weight sat at roughly 4,020 kilograms. At maximum takeoff weight of about 5,250 kilos, the B-2 managed a top speed of 407 kilometers per hour, 253 miles per hour, at 3,830 meters. Cruising speed was a sedate 315 kilometers per hour. By the standards of 1942, that was profoundly slow. And here's the thing, that slowness wasn't entirely a failure. Nikolaus had designed an aircraft meant to loiter at low altitude over a battlefield, not to race away from fighters. The speed was a problem, but it was also, in a strange way, the point. Now, about that cockpit. Because this is where the HS129's failures stop being abstract and become viscerally, almost comically specific. Nikolaus had made the armoured bathtub as compact as possible to minimise the area needing protection, and the result was a cockpit so cramped that several key flight instruments physically could not fit inside it. I want you to sit with that for a moment. The engine revolution counters, oil temperature gauges and other instruments had to be mounted on the inner faces of the engine nacelles, visible only through small side windows. The pilot couldn't read his own engine gauges in poor weather or at night. The canopy was so tight that pilots of above-average build sometimes couldn't get into the aircraft at all. And those who did found their movements so restricted that looking over their shoulder, a basic survival action in combat, was nearly impossible. German pilots flying this machine went to war unable to see their instruments, unable to turn their heads, crammed into an armoured box that protected them from bullets, but not from the operational consequences of its own design. The Gnome-Rhone engines brought their own catalogue of miseries. In North Africa, fine desert sand chewed through engine intakes and eroded components. On the Eastern Front, these French-designed engines struggled with Russian winter temperatures, requiring cold start procedures that maintenance crews, trained on German engines, working with German manuals, found nearly impossible to execute with captured French spare parts that were perpetually scarce. The HS129 spent more time broken on the ground than fighting in the air. About 865 were built before production ceased in the summer of 1944. By any operational metric you care to name, sortie rate, reliability, pilot satisfaction, the HS129 was a failure. And yet, I want to walk through 5 specific design features of this failed aircraft and place each one directly alongside its equivalent on the A-10 Warthog. Because the argument here isn't that the HS129 was good. The argument is that the ideas embedded in its design were right. They just needed better engines, better materials, and a country with the industrial capacity to execute them properly. Feature 1. Twin engines. The HS129 mounted its 2 Gnome-Rhone 14M radials in nacelles on either side of the fuselage, low on the wings. Twin-engine layout was mandated partly because each available non-priority engine was individually too weak, and partly because 2 engines offered redundancy. Lose one to ground fire, limp home on the other. The A-10 mounts 2 General Electric TF34 GE100 high-bypass turbofans, producing 9,065 pounds of thrust each, positioned in pods high on the rear fuselage. They're deliberately placed there to reduce infrared signature from below and shield the exhaust behind the twin tail surfaces. The redundancy logic is identical. The A-10 can fly and fight on a single engine, and the engines are spaced far enough apart that one hit is unlikely to kill both. Where the HS129's twin engines were a compromise forced by scarcity, the A-10s were a deliberate survivability choice. Same concept, separated by a generation of engineering. Feature 2. The armoured cockpit bathtub. This is perhaps the most visually striking parallel. Nikolaus placed the HS129's pilot inside a triangular section armoured bathtub made of steel plate that enclosed the cockpit from floor to head level. Armour varied in thickness, 6 mm on the floor and lower panels, up to 12 mm in more exposed areas, with 75 mm of armoured glass in the windscreen. Total weight of the nose armour section came to about 1,080 kilograms, 2,380 pounds. A staggering proportion of the aircraft's empty weight devoted purely to keeping the pilot alive. The A-10's equivalent is its famous titanium bathtub, up to 38 millimeters of titanium plate, roughly 1.5 inches thick, weighing 544 kilograms or 1,200 pounds. That titanium shell is designed to withstand hits from 23 millimeter cannon rounds, the standard Soviet anti-aircraft caliber the A-10 was built to face. Different material, different era, far more refined. But the concept is identical. Wrap the pilot in a protective shell. Accept the weight penalty. Build the rest of the aircraft around that commitment. And here's a detail worth pausing on. No other major combat aircraft between the HS129 and the A-10 employed this specific, discrete bathtub concept as a primary design feature. The IL-2 Sturmovik used extensive armor, yes, but its armored shell was integrated into the airframe structure rather than being a separate cockpit enclosure. The bathtub, as a distinct design element, traces a remarkably clean line from Schönefeld in 1938 to Farmingdale, Long Island in the early 1970s. Feature 3. The massive nose-mounted cannon. The HS129 was designed to kill tanks, and as the war progressed and Soviet armor grew thicker, the guns grew larger. The B-1 and early B-2 variants carried two 20mm MG151/20 cannons as standard, but the real escalation came through field modification kits. The B-2/R2 could mount a 30mm MK101 anti-tank cannon in a ventral pod beneath the fuselage. The improved MK103 with higher muzzle velocity followed. And then came the extraordinary B2/R4, which mounted a BK7.5, a modified 75mm PaK-40 anti-tank gun, in a pod that protruded nearly 8 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. A 75mm cannon on an aircraft weighing less than 6 tons loaded. The recoil was punishing, the rate of fire was glacial, and the weight penalty was severe, but the weapon could kill any Soviet tank from above. The A-10 was designed around its gun rather than the other way round. The GAU-8/A Avenger is a 7-barrel 30mm Gatling-type rotary cannon, nearly 20 feet long, weighing about 620 pounds empty. With a full load of 1,174 rounds of depleted uranium armor-piercing ammunition, the complete weapon system tips the scales at over 4,000 pounds. It fires at rates up to 3,900 rounds per minute, and the recoil, roughly 10,000 pounds of force, is nearly equal to one of the aircraft's engines at full thrust. Both aircraft were platforms built to deliver a single, disproportionately large gun to the point in the sky where it could kill armor. The calibers differ. The technologies are generations apart. But the philosophy is the same. Start with the biggest gun the mission demands and build a flyable aircraft around it. Feature 4. Landing gear that protrudes. I want to be careful here because this parallel is genuine but sometimes overstated. The HS129's main landing gear was designed for rough field operations. The frozen, muddy, improvised airstrips of the Eastern Front demanded gear robust enough to handle surfaces that would have destroyed a Messerschmitt. When retracted, the main wheels weren't fully enclosed within the nacelles. They remained partially exposed, which meant, in a gear-up or belly landing, the protruding wheels would contact the ground first, absorbing some impact before the fuselage hit. Whether this was a deliberate survivability feature or simply a consequence of nacelle geometry isn't entirely clear from available sources, and I'd rather flag that than oversell it. The A-10's case is more definitive. Its main gear units retract into fairings beneath the fuselage, but are specifically designed to protrude partially when stowed, so that a wheels-up landing results in the aircraft sliding on the gear pods rather than the bare belly. Documented. Intentional. The parallel is real. The HS129 side of it is less definitively intentional than the A-10 side. That's just being honest. Feature 5. Slow and low. Both aircraft were designed to fly low, fly slow, absorb punishment, and stay over the battlefield, delivering sustained fire rather than racing through at high speed. The HS129 at 253 miles per hour was slow by 1942 standards. The A-10 at roughly 439 miles per hour is slow by any modern jet standard. Neither was designed to survive by outrunning threats. Both were designed to survive by absorbing hits that would destroy other aircraft, and by being maneuverable enough at low speed to jink through ground fire. The HS129's low-speed handling was reportedly terrible. Sluggish controls, limited maneuverability, particularly on one engine. The A-10's low-speed handling is one of its most celebrated strengths. But the underlying philosophy is shared. Accept slow speed as the price of armour, firepower and loiter time, and design the aircraft to survive the ground fire environment that slow speed creates. 5 features: twin engines, armoured bathtub, giant cannon, protruding landing gear, slow and low survivability. All 5 present in the HS129. All 5 present in the A-10. No other aircraft in between contained all 5 in a single airframe. That is not nothing. But it's also not proof. Design convergence. 2 teams facing the same problem and arriving at the same solution independently is a real phenomenon in engineering. It's entirely possible that twin engines, heavy armour, a big gun, and low-speed optimization are simply the inevitable answers to the CAS problem, and that any competent team, given the same requirements, would reach a similar design, whether or not they'd ever heard of the HS129. So the question becomes, did the A-10's designers actually know about this aircraft? Did the ideas travel, or did they just rhyme? This is where a specific man enters the story, and where things get both more compelling and considerably more complicated. Hans Rudel was the most decorated German combat pilot of the Second World War. His tally, 519 tanks destroyed, over 800 vehicles, the Soviet battleship Murat sunk in Kronstadt harbour, and numerous other targets across thousands of combat sorties on the Eastern Front. By any measure, the most experienced close air support pilot who ever lived. And he flew Junkers Ju-87 Stukas, not HS129s. That distinction matters enormously to the honesty of this argument, and we're coming back to it. He flew specifically the cannon-armed Ju-87G variant, 2 underwing 37mm anti-tank guns, essentially a flying gun platform driven by the same kill tanks from above philosophy that drove the HS129 program, but on a different airframe. He operated on the same Eastern Front battlefields, against the same Soviet armour, at the same low altitudes, in the same ground fire environment as the HS129 units. His experience was a parallel stream of CAS knowledge, drawn from the same war and the same conditions, but not from direct experience of the HS129 itself. After the war, Rudel wrote his memoir, published in German in 1949 under the title Trotzdem, In Spite of Everything, and translated into English as Stuka Pilot, The book is a detailed first-person account of what it meant to fly close air support over the Eastern Front for years. How targets were identified and attacked, what altitudes and approach angles worked, what threats the pilot faced from below and from fighters, what an aircraft needed in terms of armor, firepower, speed and agility to survive the CAS mission day after day. Whatever one thinks of the man who wrote it, and I need to address this directly, the operational content of Stuka Pilot is one of the most granular first-person accounts of dedicated ground attack flying ever committed to paper. Rudel was, after the war, an unrepentant National Socialist. He fled to Argentina, associated with far-right political movements, and never expressed remorse for his wartime allegiance. That context matters.
It doesn't erase his operational experience, and it doesn't invalidate the tactical lessons in the memoir. But it does mean that anyone who drew on his work did so knowing exactly who they were reading. Compartmentalizing expertise from ideology is uncomfortable. The people who made the A-10 did it anyway. Here's the connection that one of you supplied in the comments, and that forms the spine of this entire narrative. A 2014 article in HistoryNet investigating the origins of the A-10 program states directly that Pierre Sprey, the Pentagon analyst who was one of the key architects of the A-10 program's requirements, had studied the Stuka, and that one of his heroes was Hans Rudel. Sprey was part of what became known as the Fighter Mafia, a group of Pentagon reformers including the legendary theorist Colonel John Boyd and analyst Chuck Myers. These men argued throughout the late 1960s that the United States Air Force had lost its way, building expensive, complex, multi-role aircraft that could do everything adequately and nothing superbly, while infantry on the ground in Vietnam were dying for lack of effective close air support. The workhorse CAS aircraft in Vietnam was the Douglas A-1 Sky Raider, propeller-driven, Korean War era, slow, tough, could carry enormous ordnance loads, could loiter over a battlefield for hours. Pilots and ground troops loved it. But the Sky Raider was aging out, and the jet-age replacements, fast, sleek fighter bombers like the F-100 and the F-4 Phantom, were catastrophically ill-suited to the CAS mission. They flew too fast to identify ground targets, burned fuel too quickly to loiter, carried inadequate armor, and cost far too much to risk at the altitudes where close air support actually happens. That operational crisis created the conditions for the AX program, Attack Experimental, formally initiated in 1966 with a request for proposals issued to industry in 1970. Spray's influence on the requirements was significant, though he was one voice among several, and the precise extent of his personal impact is debated. What's clear is that when he sat down to define what a dedicated CAS aircraft needed to be, he didn't start from a blank sheet. He went to history. He studied Eastern Front ground attack operations. Rudel's memoir was among his sources. The requirements that emerged bore a striking resemblance to lessons from that war. The aircraft had to survive ground fire, carry a large anti-armor weapon, loiter at low altitude for extended periods, operate from rough or damaged airfields, and be cheap enough and durable enough that losing some to ground fire was an acceptable operational cost. Two companies reached the fly-off stage, Northrop with the YA-9A and Fairchild Republic with the YA-10A. The YA-10A made its first flight on 10th of May 1972. Fairchild's design was selected in January 1973, and the aircraft that entered production was built, almost literally, around the GAU-8/A Avenger cannon. So here's the chain as I see it, and here's where I owe you precision about what's strong and what's thin. The strong part. Pierre Sprey studied Rudel's memoir. Rudel's memoir contains detailed operational lessons about what a CAS aircraft needs to survive and fight effectively at low altitude against armor. The AX requirements that Sprey helped shape reflect those lessons. The aircraft that won the AX competition, the A-10, embodies those requirements in 5 specific design features that have clear parallels in the HS129. That chain is documented. It's real. The thin part. Rudel flew Stukas, not HS129s. His memoir is about Stuka operations, not HS129 operations. There's no documented evidence that Sprey or anyone else in the AX program studied the HS129 specifically. The connection between the HS129 and the A-10 may run not through direct study of the Henschel aircraft, but through a convergence. The HS129 embodied certain CAS design principles. Rudel's Eastern Front experience validated those same principles from a different cockpit. And the AX program absorbed those principles through Rudel's account without necessarily knowing or caring that a German twin-engine ground attacker had already tried to build them into an airframe 30 years earlier. Is the HS129 the father of the A-10? Or is it more like a forgotten uncle? Same family, same genes, but the family tree runs through a different branch than you'd expect. I think the honest answer is somewhere in between. The HS129 was the first aircraft ever designed from scratch around the specific combination of features that define the A-10. It wasn't adapted to the role. It wasn't a fighter pressed into ground attack. It was conceived from the first specification as an armoured, twin-engine, cannon-armed, low-altitude tank killer. That concept, that specific job description, is the A-10's job description, word for word. And the man whose written experience most directly influenced the A-10's requirements fought on the same battlefields, in the same conditions, against the same threats, pursuing the same mission as the HS129 crews. The ideas didn't necessarily travel through the HS129's blueprints. They travelled through the shared experience of the Eastern Front CAS war that the HS129 was built to fight. I should mention the IL-2 Sturmovik, because some of you will rightly point out that the Soviets built an armoured ground attacker that was far more successful than the HS129. Over 36,000 produced, the backbone of Soviet tactical air power. And yes, the IL-2 is part of this family tree. But the IL-2's armour was structural, integrated into the airframe rather than a discrete bathtub. It was a single-engine design. It didn't carry a dedicated anti-tank cannon as its primary armament in the same way. The IL-2 is a cousin. The HS129 is the closer relative. Not because it was better, but because its specific design choices map more precisely onto what the A-10 became. And the A-1 Skyraider deserves credit too. The Skyraider's performance in Vietnam was arguably the most direct catalyst for the A-10 program. It proved, in a war the Pentagon was actually fighting, that slow, tough, and well-armed beat fast, fragile, and expensive for close air support. Without the Skyraider's example, there might have been no A-10 program at all, regardless of what anyone had read about the Eastern Front. The A-10 didn't have one father, it had several. Vietnam combat experience, the Skyraider's legacy, Boyd's energy maneuverability theory, Sprey's historical research, the fighter mafia's institutional war against Pentagon procurement culture. And somewhere in that mix, filtered through a controversial pilot's memoir, the hard-won lessons of the Eastern Front. Lessons that the HS129 had tried to embody in steel and armoured glass before the technology existed to make them work. The HS129 was a failure by almost every operational metric.
underpowered, unreliable, cramped to the point of parody. Its pilots couldn't read their instruments, couldn't turn their heads, couldn't trust their engines to start on a cold morning. About 865 built, most lost to mechanical failure, ground fire, or both. But the ideas inside it were right. Twin engines for redundancy, an armoured bathtub to keep the pilot alive, the biggest cannon the airframe could carry, landing gear built for rough fields and ugly landings, a slow, low, stubborn refusal to leave the battlefield until the tanks below were burning. Those ideas didn't die with the aircraft. They travelled through shared doctrine, through operational memory, through one deeply problematic man's written account of what it meant to fight a ground war from the air, until they landed, decades later, on the desk of a Pentagon analyst who was trying to build something better. And what he helped build, the A-10 Thunderbolt II, became the most beloved close air support aircraft in history. The HS129 didn't survive the war. Its design DNA did. And there's a particular irony in the fact that the A-10, symbol of American air power, the aircraft that defined a generation of ground troops' trust in the sky above them, carries in its bones the blueprint of a German aircraft that could barely fly. You suspected it. Now you've got the evidence. Whether that makes the HS129 the father, the uncle, or just the proof of concept that showed the idea could work even when everything else went wrong, that's a distinction I'll leave with you. If you found this worth your time, subscribe. We've got more of these to build.